almost wonder if you don't need wider doors to get the, it's like a bottleneck, everybody heading in that direction. Christine stands at the edge of the pool with her arms out, beckoning me, closer, Daddy, closer. Now, I know she can swim, but she stands there and she wobbles, back and forth, and she has doubts. Now, if we were to put it into words, it's not that she doubts whether or not I really exist. She knows that. It's not that she doubts my ability to catch her. I mean, she sits there and watches me lift weights. She knows I can. And I don't think she doubts my desire to catch her, although I have taken her and physically tossed her into the middle of the pool a few times. Yet there she wavers for several long moments, unable to leap, asking me to inch closer and closer until her fingers can touch mine so that she can be sure before she jumps. Now, we've been talking about other religions, and today we're going to talk about atheists and agnostics. And when we talk about doubt, I think we have to start by defining what we mean when we say faith. Faith in the Christian sense is not Christine's intellectual understanding of my level of strength or my catching skills. Faith is her trusting me enough to jump, believing that I will catch her. Abraham is called the forefather of our faith. We are first introduced to him when God appears to a random old guy in Mesopotamia and makes him a bunch of promises. And he says, Abraham, you're really old. You're going to have kids. I'm going to make your kids into a nation. I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to bless you incredibly. And here is how Abraham responds. God says, go to this land. And so Abraham went as the Lord told him. This is what biblical faith looks like. Abraham believed that what God has promised was true, and he acted on it. Faith is trusting God enough to jump. Biblical faith always expresses itself in action. Go to Hebrews chapter 11. All those heroes of the faith are not sitting there just making intellectual statements about the existence of God. Every one of them is putting it into action, and they are risking things. They are trusting God. And so in looking at how people view God, there is probably the fastest growing segment in terms of religious belief in America looks something like this. And we've gone through, polytheists, there are a bunch of little gods out there. And many people would look at the universe and say, what I can see, matter and energy and the laws of physics, that is all that exists. And there is nothing more. This is what atheism is. Now, most people, if they describe themselves as an atheist and say there is no God, if they're intellectually honest, they'll say it is something of a statement of faith. Because technically, it is impossible to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt the non-existence of God. There's a bunch of philosophy that goes into that. So an intellectually honest atheist will say it's something like this. They'll say, I don't have absolute proof that God does not exist. They'll say, but I feel I have enough evidence, and therefore I will live as if there is no God. Now, what I find fascinating is this is the exact inverse of Christian faith. We do not possess absolute proof of the existence of God. He has not appeared to me face to face. And yet, I do have enough evidence, I am sure, that he does exist. And so I will live and base my life on that belief. Now, a lot more common than people who out and out say, oh, there is no God, is people for whom the world looks something like this. There's just kind of a big question mark that's hanging there. This is an agnostic. Now, there are two kinds. We'll get to the second kind in a moment. But a lot of people, we see this, for instance, in our youth program. We have a lot of students come through the door of this church. They're invited by their friends, come and get trounced in football by a full-grown man at our church as I play out there with them. And they come in and they have no background understanding of church. Some of them have never set foot in a church before. And they come in here, and so it's just unfamiliar. And being asked for them, sometimes being asked to jump all the way in, almost feels like somebody asking you to marry them on the second date. It's like, well, hold on, I don't know enough about this Jesus guy to really make a decision, and there's this hesitation there. Sometimes people experience doubt like this when life crushes you and you feel abandoned by God. Much of the book of Psalms is written expressing just that kind of doubt. Then you have intellectual doubt. Maybe people who are raised in the church and they go to college or discover YouTube and they run into these intellectual arguments and they have not been prepared by the church. All they've ever been told from a young age is just believe. And here are these people who sound very intelligent who are describing these arguments that I've never heard of in the church. They begin to question their faith. Now, this kind of doubt says, I don't know. There's a second kind of agnosticism, which looks more like this, which would say, I can't know if there is a God. Do you hear the difference? And they're not just saying, oh, I'm not there yet. They're saying, I will never be there because it is impossible for us to know if there is a God. I've heard people say this many times. Honestly, I love asking people just an open-ended question. How would you describe your faith? Sometimes they'll say, well, I don't know. I don't think we can know if there is a God. Now, in our culture today in America, this is often viewed as a very brave kind of statement. It is considered more intellectual to doubt, more humble to say we don't know. And it is the truly brave ones who question authority and they examine everything to see if it must be cast aside. And in contrast, how proud would we have to be to say that we're certain of anything? It comes across as arrogant to these people. For me, especially as a pastor, to stand up here and say we have the truth. I'll give you an example of a story you might hear, illustrating this point of view. Some blind men encounter an elephant. One of them feels its side and says, oh, an elephant must be very much like a wall. Another one feels the tusk and says it must be very much like a spear. Another one feels the trunk and says, oh, it's very much like a snake, and so on and so on. Each of them claims to know the truth, but they only possess a part of it. So the agnostic will say, well, you see, you're so sure you only have part of it. You can't know the whole picture. Now, I would ask you, what is the viewpoint of the person who's telling this story? You right now as the audience, you look at them and you say, oh, they're so foolish, because you see. You see the whole picture. If you were blind, the story would you would have no way of knowing if any of them were true. You can only tell them their knowledge is incomplete if you see the complete picture. And so if somebody comes to me and says, you can only know part of the truth, in order for them to say that with certainty, they need to see the entire truth in order to tell me I've only got a part of it. I'll give you another example. And there's no humility there. Another example. This is, some of you might know this. This is the Riemann hypothesis. This is a math problem that's been unsolved since 1859. In fact, there is a $1 million prize for its solution. Now, you can look at this and honestly say, pretty much everybody here, I don't know how to solve that. You guys there? I don't know how to solve it. But if you were to say it can't be solved with certainty, nobody could ever solve this, then you would possess an understanding of this problem greater than anybody currently alive, and you would win the $1 million prize. You would need to possess absolute knowledge to say that nobody can know. So you can honestly say, I don't know currently if there is a God or not. But to say that you can never know that there is a God requires an absolute knowledge greater than anybody on the planet. And I would just ask, where did you get such certainty about how we can know God? These statements of agnosticism are also self-defeating. You might have somebody say, well, you should doubt everything. What about that statement? Accept that without doubt. No, believe me just because I said it, but you should doubt everything except what I just said and doubting that. And what I just said about doubting that, what I just said. Somebody says, you can't know absolute truth. That itself is a statement about absolute truth. Is it true or not? They're saying that it's absolutely true that you can't know absolute truth. It defeats itself. I used to believe this way. I used to go around spouting this proverb, in order to truly believe anything, you have to start by doubting it. And I never once considered if I should apply that same logic to that belief itself. Not only is it self-defeating, it is intolerable to live without faith. You can't do it. One of my favorite book series, A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's this character who appears in it, and he has this attitude of utter skepticism towards everything. And here's what he says. He says, my universe is my eyes and ears. Anything else is hearsay. And so the characters are like trying to have a conversation with them, but he refuses to acknowledge even that the past is real. He says, well, I think that yesterday happened, but it could just be an illusion created by my mind to account for what I see today. He says, I can only say even what appears to my eyes could be faulty, I don't know. And it's like absolutely maddening for them to try and have a conversation with somebody like that, because that's not how we live. You go to work. You don't know if they're going to pay you at the end of the week. In fact, some of you have had that not happen. That is an act of faith. You take that money, and I've been trying to explain this to Christine, like we take the money to the bank and we give it to them, and we hope that at some future point they'll give it back. I don't have certainty of that. I'm not going there and demanding that I see like a live video stream of the physical cash deposit at all times so I know it's still there. It's a great deal of trust there. When you're driving down the road and you're going this way and you see somebody else coming that way and there's a stop sign, you've got to trust that they're going to... I have a hard time with that. Especially around here because y'all aren't used to seeing other cars on the road. I try and like hedge it halfway, like I'm going to slow down so if we're about to do this, it'll be not as bad. Nobody lives without trusting anything. It's impossible. And so what we do then is we search. We say, okay, well, it's impossible to live never trusting anything, so I'm looking for some kind of solid ground to build my life upon. I have to trust something in order to get by. What can I trust? Everybody who's been through high school philosophy is familiar with Rene Descartes. You all know the statement, I think, therefore I am. And what this guy set out to do is he said, I want to build my life on absolute certainty. So he started with this statement, I think, therefore I am. And he tried to build an entire system of philosophy that could not possibly be wrong. And everybody since him has kind of looked at him and laughed and said, yeah, that was a complete failure. You're building a sandcastle in the air. And so today, what's far more common than that is for you to say, well, my feelings is what I'm going to build. And they don't usually like state it like that, but in practice, here's what that looks like. Because when you build your life saying my feelings are the only thing I'm certain of, you judge everything by what feels right to you. And so people will go and they'll question, for instance, the moral character of the Bible. Because they start with saying, well, what do I feel like God should do? And then if what they encounter doesn't match with what they feel God should do, I'm certain of my feelings, I reject what goes against it. But I wonder if they ever question if their feelings can be dreadfully wrong. I mean, what about people who refuse to vaccinate their children? They have very intense feelings about that. And now we get to have measles again. Isn't that fun? Can your feelings be sincere and yet terribly wrong at the same time? We can't build our life on that. So then other people say, well, I'm going to be an empiricist. I'm only going to trust what my eyes can see, my eyes can see and my ears can hear and I can touch with my hands, and that's the only thing I'm going to trust. I remember as a young kid being blown away by, optical illusions, and you have where the optic nerve enters the eye, and you close one eye and you look and the one X just like disappears. And we realize that my senses can be deceived. Of course, like this generation's version of that is some dress, and suddenly everybody's like, I can't trust my eyes! We can't depend on that. So usually the fallback when they say, well, if I can't build my life on pure reason, if my feelings are an unreliable gauge of the truth, and if I can't even trust what my eyes see, well, science is usually the fallback position. And here recently, just in the last 2 years, massive crisis in the scientific community. See, science depends on if, like, I do an experiment and I write down the methods, that somebody else should be able to use those same methods, do the same experiment, and get the same results. And yet what they found, they went back and actually tested this. So they took the most respected journals, Nature and Science, the highest and most respected journals, and they went back and tested them. And what they found in some fields, fewer than 50% of the experiments yielded the same results. Massive crisis of faith. Does this even work? What is wrong? Why is this happening? And if this happens to the best and most respected journals, how sure can we be? I'm not saying this because I hate science. I love science. I grew up wanting to be a scientist. And yet, you cannot avoid faith in science. Now, it's not the way most people would define it, but if faith is defined by leaping and acting even when you don't have certain proof, in order for science to work, you have to assume that the future will resemble the past. You have no way of testing that with science. You have to assume that the universe is rational and can be understood. There's no way to test that. Now, these might seem like very safe assumptions to make, but they are assumptions still the same. Einstein's theories were accepted long before there was any experimental proof of them. These theories, they made sense, they were comprehensive, and they were beautiful. So they accepted them. How is that any different than a theologian who accepts the authority of the Bible? Because there will come a day when we will know for sure the truth or falsehood of these things. And then when it comes to the issue of authority, many people one of the greatest critiques of the church, especially during the Enlightenment, was you're going to sit up there and you're going to have some priest or pastor tell you, you can't understand, trust me, I will interpret for you. And we reject against the idea, nobody's going to tell me what to believe. That's why I hated the idea of pastors as a teenager. It's so ironic for me now. Here's the thing though, you can't escape this with science. And let me just give you an example. When it comes to climate change, right? When you start talking about climate change, they almost immediately begin to appeal to authority. You get graphs like this. 97% of scientists agree that we're causing like global warming. Because they say, well, the data is so complex and there's so much of it that you can't understand it, right? And so what you need to do is trust us and we will interpret the data for you. And even people who reject it are doing so typically not because you've read all the studies and made a decision for yourself. You're just trusting a different authority source. It's impossible to escape this. In order to learn anything, you have to trust. When I learned Spanish from my coworkers on a construction crew, I had to trust them. They told me elefante means elephant. I had no, I didn't have an internet-connected phone at the time, so I couldn't just Google it. I had to trust them. They told me my name. And your name in Spanish is Cerdo. I went around for like 2 months. Oh, me llamo Cerdo, gringo. And then somebody was like, yeah, that means pig. You have to trust people, though. You sit under a teacher. In order to learn about science, you sit under a teacher who relies on textbooks and the people who taught them. That is the definition of tradition. You can't escape authority, you can't escape faith, and you can't escape tradition, even within science. It's impossible for you to sit in physics class and say, I'm not going to believe anything you tell me unless I personally perform the experiments that validate it. Nobody does that. It'd take a really long time if you were to try and develop Euclidean geometry entirely on your own without trusting what the teacher's telling you. And so what does it look like when we reject the authority and tradition and faith assumptions of science? That's when you get flat earth truthers. Think about it. What these people do is they say, I won't accept the authority of others to tell me what to believe. I won't accept centuries of tradition. I will examine the evidence for myself, mainly on YouTube. And if you think about it, that is like precisely the attitude of atheists and agnostics. And yet, trusting in their own judgment, there are some people who find conspiracy theories like this incredibly convincing. And so here's the thing. Your personal judgment can be critically flawed in ways that you're not aware of. In fact, they are. There's a scratch across the lens of your soul that makes everything look wrong no matter where you look. Here's what the Bible says. You're not neutral in this question. Nobody comes to the idea of the existence of God as like a dispassionate third-party observer. Like, I will install myself as a neutral judge. Everybody's got a horse in this game. Jude 1:18, in the last time there will be scoffers, following their own ungodly passions. Same thing in 2 Peter 3:3. Knowing this, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. So these people who laugh at the idea of God, if we're honest, a vague God makes no demands of you. And that's how I lived. I wanted to throw up a cloud of dust over the whole question of the truth of the Bible, the existence of Jesus, because I knew the way I was living. And if there's a cloud of uncertainty that allows me to continue in the convenient way of life that I'm used to without answering to anybody, I wasn't neutral. Every area of human law in every nation acknowledges that you can't judge a situation that affects you. You can't have a judge sit over his own murder trial. It's hereby dismissed. We accept that his personal involvement would make it impossible for him to give a fair ruling. Then why do we think that we are somehow able to be different when it comes to the question of God? You're not neutral. For some people, if you're honest with yourself, your doubt is a cover story. Now, other people, they're just scared of the jump. I don't want to be wrong. You ever sit in church and wonder how stupid you look if this is all false? I've done that. Middle of worship sometimes, like, man, if I am singing at an empty wall, like, this is all for nothing. And so for some people, like, to just refuse to jump at all because I might fall seems the safer option. But let me tell you, there's no safety against being wrong anywhere. There is no rail that you can cling to and just like take the steps. You've got to make a decision one way or another. And in fact, you can't remain uncertain. Whatever the case may be, who is God and how do I relate to him? This is such a massively important question for your life that to leave it as like some intellectual debate, it's nonsense. If I thought that the government might be run by lizard people, that is not a question I can be like, well, it's kind of interesting. I'm like 50-50 either way. No! If I honestly thought it was like 50-50 either way, I am going to like pursue this until I know one way or another, because that really changes some things. There's no other question that you can ask that has such a massive impact on your life. In fact, to put off making a decision about Jesus is in itself a decision. Because Jesus told people, he says, I told you that you would die in your sins. For unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. Jesus did not leave you the option of sitting on the fence till the day you die and saying, I'll see God, and then I'll know for sure. That is a decision against him. You've got to call this thing in the air. You've got to land somewhere. Some people, you're just flying in circles. And you're running out of fuel. Because you're afraid that this landing strip that Christianity, it seems appealing, but you don't want to be wrong, and so you're just going to keep flying in circles. What are you waiting for? So, well, I want it to be true. It'd be awesome if I could land there, but I don't know. Take heart, by the way. That exact feeling, it appears in Scripture as a man brings his son who had been ill for a very long time to the disciples, hearing that they could heal people. And the disciples can't heal him. The crowd has begun to gather. He's arguing with them. And then Jesus shows up. And he explains what's going on, and the guy tells Jesus, but if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. If your disciples have failed, you're their guru or whatever, maybe you can do something, maybe. So there's this element of doubt there. And what I find interesting in my generation is there has been this glorification of doubt in the church. And I get where they're coming from, because the previous generation, a lot of times you would come into a church and you'd have somebody up here and say, absolute certainty, never any room for gray, it's all black and white, you know, I have absolute certainty about every single thing that I teach. And they never acknowledged the reality of doubts that people felt, never allowed them to really go through that process of questioning. And so you've produced people like Mark Bell, who will challenge every concept of Christian doctrine. He wrote a book about how, and all they do is they ask questions. So Mark Bell writes this book about hell, and he says, I don't know, is it there? Maybe, maybe not. I don't want to say for sure. And he just wants to leave you hanging there, uncertain. You have another guy wrote a book, The Sin of Certainty. I mean, it's just like entirely turning the thing on its head. And here's the thing, Jesus never is impressed by somebody refusing to believe him. He never responds to doubt and he's like, oh, that's totally cool. I want to leave you just like that. Don't change a thing. Now, the important thing, though, is that this guy brought his kid to Jesus. Even as he's standing there, he's saying, well, if you can do anything. So he's not there yet. But he brought his kid to Jesus. So if you're sitting here today and you've got doubts, where are you going to take them? Google? And here's how Jesus responds. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. Do you hear his heart there? As he's in this moment, he's like, I want my son to be healed, and I want to think that you can do it. But he's being honest here. He says, I want to believe, help my unbelief. You need to understand that God knows what doubt can do to a person. And Jesus at this point does not turn him away. That's what a lot of people are scared of. They're scared in the church to ask questions because they've grown up under having the feeling that if you come to people apologize to me for having doubts. Like, I don't want to offend you, but. Because the expected response is like anger and rejection. And here this guy is, to Jesus' face, tell him, I don't know if you can do it. And he says, help my unbelief. Jesus does not, at this point, shut down the conversation and says, come back when you have faith. What does he do? He heals his son. Doesn't leave him to wonder. He meets him where he's at. I believe that God will do the same thing with you. That's what he did with me. And it's so interesting for me, Background in science, built my life on philosophy and rational thought, that it was through an experience in a church that God gave me just an overwhelming sense of his presence and love and forgiveness, and that is what brought me to faith. For other people, maybe through finding clear answers to your questions. I went through, after that point, a long process of saying, well, how can I know any of this is true? How can I know, why should I believe the Bible? Why should I believe that Jesus is who he said he is? Examining tough questions and finding that I didn't have to set my brain to the side in order to trust in Jesus. And maybe you're listening to this whole thing and like, man, you just wasted a half hour of my life. I've never doubted once in my life. God bless you. But we are told, and I want you to get this, if you're one of those people just blessed with rock-solid faith from the earliest moment of your memory, we are commanded, look at Jude 1:22, have mercy on those who doubt. So even if you're talking to someone and you've never been in their shoes, the attitude we're commanded to have towards them is that of mercy. That is the way that Jesus responded to the Father. He brought his Son down. Now, some of you, you're here today, and it's not like you're doubting the existence of God, but what you're doing is you're standing at the edge of the pool, and you know very clearly what God is calling you to do. You know some area of your life that needs surrendering to him? Or you've been trying to hedge your bets, like me slowing down, seeing somebody come crossways at me on the road. You're trying to live your life so that you're totally cool if Jesus doesn't come through, but you also want to be kind of following him, and it is time for you to jump. You cannot sit there on the edge forever, and it is not, again, a jump to believe the ridiculous. You are trusting in a person. Today, will you trust in Jesus? Because he is holding out his hands to you. He says, I knock if anyone answers the door. So we're going to pray. I'd like somebody to pray with you. I invite you to come forward. I pray that God resolves, brings you through doubt and into faith. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your great mercy and love towards us. That even in our darkest moments of doubt, your promises hold true. That we can trust in you, and it is not a blind faith, that you have provided us over and over again examples of your faithfulness. So God, I pray that you'd help each of us to leap into your arms in whatever way that may look like this morning. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Stand with us. Just